Welcome to Scriptural Science, a presentation of Truth and Life Institute, Boston, Massachusetts, and Oba, Nigeria. The following is a subsection of the book. Life is a Journey in God Through God, written and published by Ifeanyi Chukwujima, scriptural scientist and a servant of God. This subsection's ID is Journey in God, Book 5:3b. No government anywhere has more authority than a husband. No human governing authority anywhere has greater authority over its subjects than the authority which God had given to the husband in his marriage and household. The husband's authority is the pivotal point of all human governing authorities the world over, Genesis 1 verse 28 and Genesis 3 verse 16 combined. In Genesis, God gave to the married couple, Adam and Eve, the authority to rule over all of God's creation on the earth, Genesis 1 verse 28. Their marriage and the government of the entire world were one, but not the same or exchangeable with each other. Adam and Eve were married to each other, and they were also the government of the entire world. There was no other government besides their marriage. The authority and power of all world governments are each a detachment from the authority and power of marriage. Marriage came before government. The first thing God commanded Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and increase in number. That is not government, but marriage and family. Ruling over the earth was the last thing God had commanded Adam and Eve, who had become one through their marriage. That places marriage and family ahead of government. God created Adam and gave Adam authority to rule, but there were no human subjects to rule until God created a companion for Adam, Eve, and brought her to Adam and married them. Therefore, the authority and power of all world governments are each a detachment from the authority and power of marriage. Adam and Eve did not receive the authority and power to rule the world before they were married. Genesis 1 verse 28, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Their marriage allowed them to become joint heirs of the authority and power to rule the world. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth, Genesis 1 verse 28 is God blessing their marriage so they can be successful in government and everything else they do and not their government. The second part of Genesis 1 verse 28 is God now blessing their government. Subsequently, however, God commanded Eve to willingly submit to her husband's governing authority and not wait for the hammer to come down on her before she does so, and he will rule over you. Genesis 3 verse 16. We have established in the preceding paragraph that their marriage was the only institution of human government in the world. With this new command, we now know that Adam was placed at the head of their marriage, which also became the world government the moment they received the power and the authority from God to reign throughout the earth. These two commands from God, Genesis 1 verse 28 and Genesis 3 verse 16 combined, makes Adam the supreme ruler over all things on the earth, including his family. This is the reason why the husband's authority is the pivotal point of all human governing authorities the world over. Adam's authority and power to rule the world is what Satan stole from mankind when Satan deceived Eve into sinning against God at the Garden of Eden. Placing the authority of governments over the authority of the husband in his marriage is human beings doing the work of the devil. Adam lost the authority and power to rule the world because he failed to take control of his responsibilities and properly execute the duties of his office, Genesis 3 verse 17. Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. And Eve fell into sin and disobeyed God because she exceeded her authority and exercised the powers she never had in the first place. Instead of allowing herself to be led, she took the lead and brought her husband down with her. So, in reprimand, God commanded her to stay within her authority and powers. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Genesis 3 verse 16. Through God's free spirit as automation, God teaches the fishes of the seas, the birds of the air, and all the creatures in the wild, to know to submit to human beings and not to terrorize them. Genesis 9, verse 2. But God did not automate the wife's submission to her husband because God had allowed the human beings the freedom to choose to do what is right, or to do whatever they choose to do in rebellion against God and face the consequences that result from their disobedience. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23. The only difference between the husband's governing authority and every other human governing authority is that while the husband extends an olive branch to his wife as a sign of love, seeking his wife's love and friendship, the other human governing authorities rule by domination and could care less about love and friendship. And now that governments have extended their powers into marriages, they could care less if any marriage remains intact. Infidelities, marital disagreements, and divorces fuel the legal professions and grow economies. Authority is not something anyone should recoil from because all authority comes from God. If authority is something to sneer at or undermine, God would not have authority, nor would he apportion authority to mankind. God never gives a bad gift to the ones he loves. It was God's authority over all creations that permit God to set boundaries for all creations. Authority is the reason there is love. Authority does not preclude love. Authority is the reason there is love. See the diagram below. Figure 1. Everything is held together by authority, which must remain strong and resolute to foster love, mercy, and peace. Being set free from domination is love going from authority to the one under authority. And willing submission to authority is love, going from the one under authority to authority. This is the only formula of life that works. It works not only between a husband and his wife, but also in all the other human relationships. God designed willing submission to feed relationships and make love blossom, thereby supporting friendship. Domination destroys friendship. Disobedience is anti-Christ and so anti-love. However, disobedience is even a greater enemy of friendship than domination, because while domination has authority on its side, disobedience is simply an anarchist, a rebel without cause. No one under authority has rights over the authority. This is the reason why human governments resort to enforcement to secure submission. Romans 13, verse 4. This is also why the Bible commands all human beings to submit to all authorities, including the harsh ones, declaring, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. 3. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. 5. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. 6. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. 7. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. 8. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. 9. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. 10. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. 11. And do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. 12. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. 13. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. 14 Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. Romans 13 verses 1 to 14. Disobedience draws no sympathy, no support, and no sacrifices, because disobedience devastates orderliness and creates anarchy. The most senseless thing about disobedience is that those who disobey demand most obedience from others. How can someone demand something they adamantly refuse to give to others? When the disobedient get into authority, they are tyrannical in their demands for obedience from others, making them use domination exclusively. Disobedience is a friend to no one, including self. In a family setting, however, domination and disobedience have equal destructive impacts. Yet, in the end, it is disobedience that causes a family the most grief, because when submission stagnates, domination, unfortunately, must surface for the sake of authority. Otherwise, usurpation happens and takes God out of the authority equation. Like corporate managements, God always sides with authority anywhere both disobedience and domination coexist. Power is in the objectivity of the hierarchy of authority and not in the political correctness of a command. Power is in the objectivity of the hierarchy of authority and not in the political correctness of a command. He will rule over you, Genesis 3 verse 16, simply mandates loyalty, respect, and honor, and intrinsically returns great rewards for compliance, not only from the one who rules, but more importantly from God who rules both the ruler and the one who submits. Everything becomes meaningless when authority is trampled underfoot. Brutality is always the result anytime authority is trampled underfoot. And God does not stay on the sideline and watch authority trampled underfoot, because all authority comes from God. That is why God promptly commanded Hagar to go back to her mistress, Sarah, and submit to Sarah. This is God's authorized way to resolve insubordination. Willing submission must always be the first step. This is also in full display when God spoke to Aaron about putting his weight behind his authority as the chief priest in protecting the furnishings of the sanctuary and the altar. Aaron must ensure that all violators were put to death. Otherwise, both the violator and Aaron would lose their lives because of the violator's disobedience and Aaron's failure to carry out God's commanded punishment for such disobedience. They are to be responsible to you and are to perform all the duties of the tent, but they must not go near the furnishings of the sanctuary or the altar. Otherwise, both they and you will die. For they are to join you and be responsible for the care of the tent of meeting, all the work at the tent, and no one else may come near where you are. 5 You are to be responsible for the care of the sanctuary and the altar, so that my wrath will not fall on the Israelites again. 6 I myself have selected your fellow Levites from among the Israelites as a gift to you, dedicated to the Lord to do the work at the tent of meeting. 7 But only you and your sons may serve as priests in connection with everything at the altar and inside the curtain. I am giving you the service of the priesthood as a gift. Anyone else who comes near the sanctuary is to be put to death. Numbers 18:3-7. Receiving authority from God to oversee anything has dire consequences, even to head your family, as is the case for husbands, or to hold your family together, as is the case for wives. We should all look at the preceding passage concerning the consequences of neglecting our God-given authority before we abandon ours. We may choose to give up our God-assigned authority, but God would not absolve us from its responsibilities. We do not call the shot, God does. We simply must obey. In Hagar and Sarah's situation, God did not put Sarah's hard-handedness towards Hagar on trial when God spoke to Hagar. God showed Hagar that the problem was in her disobedience of the one who had authority over her, that she had to correct her errors for things to get better. And Hagar promptly obeyed God and went back and submitted to Sarah, jubilant that God reached out to her personally in her difficulties and spoke to her. God still speaks to any human person who desires to hear from God and waits to hear him. Some of the greatest lessons God taught mankind in the Bible about loyalty in marriage had women on both sides, Hagar and Sarah, and Ruth and Naomi. It was marriage ties that had Hagar carrying Abraham's baby. Hagar was abusing a woman who had humbled herself more than anyone else to allow God's promise to her husband to become a reality. And God promptly sided with Sarah in all her actions, without a single condemnation from God. Through humility and self sacrifices, Sarah earned a permanent spot in God's heart and his eternal reward, salvation. Sarah became the mother of all the faithful, and Abraham, their father. It was marriage ties that got Ruth to totally embrace her mother in law's cause, vowing to go wherever the unfortunate woman went, live wherever the bereaved woman lived, and die wherever the vanquished woman died. Compelled by unparalleled love, Ruth turned her back on her own biological family and committed the remainder of her life to the future of the family she married into, even though the death of her husband had freed her from her marriage to her deceased husband. By law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. 3. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from that law and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. Romans 7 verses 2 to 3 NIV. She chose to continue in her own ionic bond instead of going back to the covalent bonds she broke away from in her father's house to find her own destiny in life. She held on tightly to her ionic bond even when it looked like it was completely dead, since her husband was no longer alive. Although her husband was dead, but there remained something of him, which she was determined to hold on to, her dead husband's mother. Ruth held on tightly to that remnant of her promised paradise, and it paid. Off immensely, Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David and a human ancestor of Jesus Christ. God had designed the woman in every marriage to be the glue that holds her marriage and household together. Every family must retain God's structure of authority or fall apart at the seams. Family starts with the man as head of the household, but grows and strengthens around the woman, who holds the marriage and family together. God made the wife the glue that holds every family together. The success or failure of every household is determined by the woman, the wife. She is God's gift to the man that continues to give. No one who messes with marriage escapes God's wrath, man or woman, wife or husband. God's punishment for messing with marriage outlasts all other punishments because the family is what holds all human societies together in God. God is the one who officiates in every legitimate marriage everywhere on the planet Earth, whether it is in New York City or in New Zealand, in London or in St. Petersburg, in the Vatican City or among the tribal pagans of the world. Because marriage everywhere on the earth belongs to God and God alone. We are all actors in God's grand theater of living, which is the family unit. We must all strive to play our respective roles well or be damned for our failures. There are only two perspectives in life, science and law. Everything else in life falls under the two. When you look at the commands of God in the Bible through the critical lens of law, you conclude that God is justified in dealing unkindly with anyone who refuses to obey his commands, because he is the authority with power. And all human beings are subject to God's authority and must obey God's authority. When you also look at the commands of God in the Bible through the critical lens of science, you will also conclude that any human being who refuses to painstakingly follow the prescribed scientific steps that are the commands of God in the Bible is endangering not only their lives, but the lives of others, and so must be restrained. In addition, their refusal to follow the prescribed scientific steps that are the commands of God in the Bible precludes them from obtaining the results promised in the Bible. Science does not get any bigger than the science of life. Denominationalism has turned the truth of God into competing brands. The reason why human science has been very successful to date is because human science is black and white. Follow the prescribed steps and succeed, or refuse to follow the prescribed steps and fail. There is no middle position for success in science. Human law, on the other hand, had devised so many different falsifications, which argue that evil can be good and that good can be evil depending on perspective. Law practitioners call it legal precedence, which is purely human manipulations. and that has been generally accepted as a basis of truth by the world. The same deception has been copied by the Christians and applied to the Word of God in the Bible, turning the eternal Word of God into religious brands, as in consumable goods, with each brand vying for its share of the gospel market. The truth of God is one and unchangeable. The truth of God is as much science as it is law. God is now putting his foot down and ordering all mankind to approach his commands in the Bible as the infinitely advanced science that they are, and not the many falsifications that believers had turned them into, in the name of the law of God. The truth of God has only one consistent and unchangeable approach, exactly as it is carefully posited by God in the Bible. That is why the Bible consistently commands believers to never turn to the left or to the right, because such would be a deviation from the truth of God and would not lead to God's promises in the Bible. That is exactly what science is made of: strict adherence to the written steps.